Hi everyone, so today I would like to show you something that you probably have seen it hundreds of times, but you never really give it much thought. So behind me, these are the archery targets that I use. The material is EVA foam, and I've turned it around so that we are looking at the back of the targets. And let's go have a close look, and you'll see some structures that are very strange. So try to pay attention to the little thingy that sticks out all over on this very, very small thingy, right? So what are these? Let's look at another target. They are very consistent across all the target. They look like worm to me, so maybe I will call them foam worm. See, they look like little worm coming out of the target. It's very consistent across the targets. See, of course, some are larger worm, fat worms. Some are thin, small worms. But have you ever wondered how these got here? How did they form? Why? It's kind of strange, right? This is very strange. Because if you think about it, if the arrow has punched through the target and made its way not completely through, but sticking out of the target, how does it look like? Actually, if the arrow somehow sticks out of the target, this is how it looks like. You see all this? Right? These are the arrowhead sticking out and making a mark. And you do not see any worm sticking out of spots where arrow actually made it through. At least the point is sticking out. You don't see that. Behind all those with the worm, they are actually the holes is so small. Let me try to pluck one out so they can see it. Let's have a look at this one here. Okay, like that. I'm gonna just kind of mark it a little bit so that we can see clearly. Okay, this one that I marked. I'm gonna pluck this off. You see, look at that hole. It's super tiny. It's so small. It could not have been the point sticking out. If that's not the point sticking out, then how is this formed? Right? How is this little worm formed? Because this is a very long piece of foam. It is not an actual worm. It is a long piece of foam that somehow is sticking right out of the target, and that hole, the arrow never went through. It didn't drag any material out. So how did this form? Today, we'll give this an exploration, and you'll be surprised what actually happens. So today we'll be talking about foam worms. Now before I start, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share our videos with your friends. So you probably might think, okay, so what's the reason and why would you want to know about this foam worm thing, right? It sounds pretty useless, right? It seems like it's not gonna give you any advantage knowing it. You're right. You're right. It is an absolutely useless information, but at the same time, it just feeds our curiosity because it's kind of weird. So I took some time to explore, and when I realized that, hey, this is something pretty cool. It's useless, but it's cool. So foam worms, all right. When I first spotted it, my initial guess is that maybe when the arrow went through the target, due to friction, it's going to heat up the surface in the hole that it made. So the heated foam kind of melted and got dragged out with the arrow, right? And then when you retrieve the arrow, then that's what's left. That's what I thought initially. But then that actually doesn't make sense, because when you look very closely, you'll find that the hole that's created here is actually smaller than the arrow itself. So the arrow actually never went through, but the worm actually sticks out really far from the hole. So the initial guess is definitely wrong. That's what you have guessed, and that's what I guessed, but it definitely is not the case. So after that, there's one situation where I actually realized that something was involved. There's actually a shock wave at that hole. So what happened was a friend of mine, he shoots a Manchu bow, so it has a pretty high poundage draw length, and the arrow is very heavy, so it gives a really good punch to it. And upon his arrow impact, there was this one time that it sounded really weird. So there was actually two sounds. the first impact, the thump of the impact, and we heard an explosion. Okay, it is definitely an explosion. It's not like a boom. It's not like that. It's pop. It's an explosion. So I was terrified initially, like because the sound is like it sounds like something went wrong. So I was looking at my friend. My friend was looking at me. We were like, "What happened? Something happened." And that sound don't sound good. It sounds like something bad happened. So we immediately went to the target to investigate what went wrong. And pretty much actually nothing went wrong. The arrow hit the target. It didn't went off course. It didn't hit metal. It didn't hit anything. Just the target. It went into the target, and it didn't hit any other arrows. There's no damage on the arrow. Nothing. But this is what we spotted. Behind the target, we saw a huge chunk missing from the target butt, and it is really big. It is approximately this size. Okay, that is nowhere near the size of the arrow. This is a lot larger than the arrow itself. So what we spot is in that huge chunk that was missing, I saw the very tip of the arrow point. Just the tip of the arrow point. Not the entire arrow, not the entire head, just the very tip of the point. Okay, like that. This is target, and the arrow didn't went through. It blew a huge chunk out, and I only saw the very tip of the point. So we searched for the missing piece, and it was a very huge conical piece. It's a cone shape, and it just blew out, kind of like imagine a cone, right? The cone shape. So a huge chunk of that blew straight up, and when it blew out quite a distance, so there is definitely some force to it. And that force could not have been just simply momentum. It is not just simply momentum, because when that happened, there was an explosion. There's a sound of an explosion. It's definitely not a thump. It is very distinct. It is clearly an explosion. Which what I meant by explosion is basically a very sudden release of a high pressure gas. So from what I understand, from what I observe, upon impact there is a very high temperature and pressure trapped air pocket at this point, in which it blew apart. It forces a cone shape outwards, and that's when the wave, the pressure there escaped this spot here, it created that explosion sound. So that's when I realized that actually, when the arrow goes in, there is actually a trapped air pocket there, and it's very high temperature, very high pressure. So you might wonder, how did the air pocket got in there, right? Because when you shoot, this point here is like that. It is not like that. It doesn't trap air, right? It doesn't trap air. It doesn't like collect air and go in there. It is pushing air away. So it's because technically the target that we use foam, and foam is basically bubbles. They are bubbles, right? They're just like rubbery surface, but inside this rubbery surface, they are just bubbles. And when the arrow smashes into the target, it tears some of the material where it impacts. It tears it. And when it tears it, it releases air. Okay, it releases air. And as the arrow pushes through the target, the surface in which it passes through, because of friction, right? Because of friction, it kind of heat up, it melts, and it kind of binds towards the arrow shaft. And that's what stops the arrow, right? It binds and try to hold and try to stop the arrow. And therefore, it actually creates a tight seal from where the entry of the arrow is. It creates a tight seal. The air cannot escape through there, and the target are generally, it's flat, it's big, wide. So there's actually a lot of material towards here, and so the air pressure couldn't go out this way, right? It couldn't go out this way. So as the arrow rams towards here, all the trapped air there is compressed into a very, very small spot here, creating a very, very highly compressed air pocket, and that's why it's both very high pressure and very high temperature. And so, because the way that target are generally designed, they are big, wide, but not that thick. Relatively, they are wider than it's thick. So the shortest path to escape, okay, the path of least resistance, basically is towards the back. Very obvious. So that trapped air pocket will try to make its way through. It tries to tear its way through the target for the remaining of the target thickness. So sometimes you have sufficient pressure due to, let's say for example, your bow has a lot of power and the arrow has a lot of weight, so it creates a very, very, very good highly compressed air. In that case, the pressure is sufficient to blow a chunk, a cone shape out. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there is not enough pressure to do that amount of damage, so it just blew just enough of a crack through the path of least resistance, the shortest path. It just blew a very tiny crack through it. When that happens, that high temperature and pressure air pocket, since there is an exit hole, right? What it does is that it tries to escape. It tries to go out, and when it goes out into the atmospheric pressure, well, technically, it's a kind of fart. The foam is farting, right? It farts. So the pressure as it escapes, because it's high temperature, high pressure, so it kind of melts the material around it, and it pushes out, it jets out. And when it jets out, once it reaches the atmospheric pressure, it expands and cools. And when it cools, the molten foam, as it jets through, the molten foam gets dragged out and then solidified just at the very end, the exit here, and that's how it forms this long worm. Kind of interesting, huh? Definitely not what you expect. It is actually caused by a fart, a foam farting. So this doesn't actually happen to all the material. So in this case, a solid EVA foam, you will get these foam worms caused by a foam fart. But if you have polyethylene foam, which is like, it's more plasticky, actually this is quite a common material, polyethylene PE, sometimes you call it PE foam. If you have this foam, it doesn't behave quite the same as an EVA, which is the one that I use. PE foam, when this happens, alright, when the air pocket blows through the back, and then it cools down, the jet stream for the hot gas, as it carries the molten foam out, it doesn't form a worm like in the case of EVA. For polyethylene, it usually, as it solidifies, it kind of creates these scrubs, plastic scrubs and or powdery scrubs. So as a result, if you shoot PE foam, you tend to get a lot of powder at the back of the target, and that's actually what happened. The explosion actually brings out molten material, and as it cools down, it solidifies into scrubs behind the target. Whereas for hay target, that doesn't happen, because for hay target, there's actually no trapped air, and so the explosion doesn't happen.